All right, welcome to the Lovecraft Easing podcast. Today is October the 22nd, 2017. Thanks for being a part of our little group here. Why don't we talk about our prizes first, Pete? Because I think you have 4 things to give away today. Jeez.
Yeah. Strix Publishing very politely sent me 2 copies of Oren Gray's Never Bet the Devil.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is a little damaged, so sorry about that, but blame the postal service. And then he also sent me 2. I guess this is the base game. It's called Unhallowed. And this is an expansion called Unhallowed Necropolis. This is a steampunk zombie game in which the premise is that the zombie apocalypse happened about 200 years ago, destroyed the world, but London and England are re-emerging, driven by a steampunk neo-Victorian culture. And it's pretty interesting, nice production values, pretty decent artwork. They actually, surprisingly, what they've done is they've actually used actual photographs sometimes, where they've gotten people dressed up and set. So, kind of interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, really nice. So, but I would put these together because you can't use one without the other. So,
Okay. So 3 prizes, basically.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, in case as I sometimes do, forget to give away the email address for the prizes, if you want to get in on these, send an email to lovecrafteasingprizes@gmail.com anytime in the next week. Again, this is October the 22nd, 2017. And a week from today, I usually randomly pick people the following Sunday. So if you're listening to this during the week, you can get in on this, not just if you're watching live. Lovecrafteasingprizes@gmail.com, and in the subject of the email, put the name of the book or the prize. So let's do introductions. Let's start over. Well, I'm Mike Davis, editor, publisher. We'll start on my end, and then let's go to Rick.
Rick Lay, writer of pulp-style fiction.
Rich.
Good evening. My name is Rich Bunting, and I'm a reader.
Rich is one of my Patreons, so we've got a couple of them on today. Pete.
I'm Pete Rollick, alcoholic.
World. Hi, Pete.
What step of the program are you on, Pete?
I am on step 1, and I've been there for about 28 years.
Okay, Paul, what about you? You want to introduce yourself real quick?
Hi, I'm Paul Andolina. I'm a Patreon, and I'm a big fan of Lovecraftian cinema as well as the writings. So.
Okay. Matt.
I am Matt Carpenter. We're still working on Pickman's Gallery.
And Mr. Young.
I'm Kel Young, executive editor of Strange Eons magazine.
So Pete had a great idea of a topic to discuss today. There was an article on, I think it was nerdist.com this past week, Pete. And the title was A Guide to Stephen King's Lovecraftian Gods. But it wasn't very in depth. It really didn't go. So you thought we?
Did we just lose Mike?
Man. Party!
Yeah.
What's that?
We just lost you. Oh, you're back.
Right.
Damn it. We thought we were gonna start drinking and cursing. It's like Dad left the house.
What's that?
You froze up.
Oh, did I?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. One of those days. Where did I leave off? A guide to Stephen King's Lovecraftian Gods at Nerdist.
Yep, but it wasn't a very in-depth article. Thought we could do better.
Right. So you guys
No.
want to talk about that? You and Rick and Kelly?
Sure. So the article does a broad brush, and it just covers a couple things. It covers it, and when and actually it
Uh-oh.
kind of hello.
Peter's now frozen.
What? The
Boy, we're
hell?
having problems today.
Am I back?
You're back.
Okay.
Yeah.
This will be a lot of editing to later on in the audio podcast.
Yeah. So it's Bob Gray, and there's a sort of the description when you actually see it without the spider guys or the clown guys. It's just this sort of cluster of orange dead lights. And it's very similar to the congery of bubbles that Yog-Sothoth is described as. But it's not Yog-Sothoth as we would think of from Lovecraft. It's more of like August Derleth's Yog-Sothoth, from Lurker at the Threshold. Sort of like, Lovecraft's Yog-Sothoth is way up here, August Derleth's is way down here. Depowered, very different. Now, there's a linkage there between it and the other Mr. Gray from the Dreamcatcher series. They both sort of use the same identity, that Mr. Gray, Robert Gray, Mr. Gray thing. And I've often thought of Dreamcatcher as a rewrite of the second half of it. Because it sort of follows some of the same issues. And you have this team of outsiders that are kids that all get together. And then later on, when they're adults, they fight monsters.
There's a reference to Pennywise in Dreamcatcher.
Yes, there is.
Yeah.
So it's a good question of, I'd love to see someday an explanation of the relationship between the invading aliens in Dreamcatcher and it in Derry. That would be kind of fun to see. Then there's the opposition. There's to Pennywise's the turtle. I'm going to fry this name. Maturin.
Maturin is how I always thought it was, yeah.
Yeah. Who is revealed in, I think, one of the Dark Tower books to be a guardian of the beams.
Mm-hmm.
A-beam.
Holds the Dark Tower up. Now, the exact power level of this guy is not to be figured out, because there's another one that's named Shardik the Bear, which is taken from a
Robert Adams.
Richard
Adams, yeah.
Novel. But he's just a cybernetic bear created by some corporation in another universe.
Well, I think that the beams all have corresponding animals.
Mm-hmm.
I think Shardik was a guardian of that gateway, but the beam that it is based on would have been the much larger, what I assumed were all kind of equally powered, elder ones, I guess, in King's. I can't quite tell.
Like
his
a pillar
stuff.
of the universe, or a
Yeah.
pillar of the multiverse. Yeah.
Yeah, something like that.
Well,
Yeah. So like,
you guys go on because
yeah.
I am by no means universe, so I'm basically listening today. But you guys just mentioned the turtle holding up the beam to the Dark Tower. Can you explain what that means?
No.
Because I'm in the middle of it right now for the first time. Kelly told me I needed to put a lot of other Stephen King stuff, but not it. I've not read the Dark Tower.
Yeah, the turtle basically appears in it, and is it the Ritual of Chud?
Oh man, yeah, that is what it's called. Where did you pull that out of?
Well, Rick and I have vast knowledge.
Now, isn't that very similar to the Bethune from N, don't you think? The name?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I just thought they didn't mention it in the article, but it seemed like a link to me. Of course, then I started thinking about Chud and cannibalistic humanoid underground dwellers, and that had nothing to do with it.
Right.
Never mind, I'm distracted.
So yeah, Mike, to get back to your question, is there's no explanation. The turtle appears in it, but the fact that it's a guardian of the beams is not mentioned. And then it's revealed to be a guardian of the beams in one of the Dark Tower stories.
Well, maybe,
But you don't get much more.
What that means, Mike, is if you can think of, I think it was the game Pickup Sticks, where these sticks all kind of sat together, and as you pulled one out, you would start ruining the integrity of this thing that had built until they all fell. If you think of the beams as something like that, and in the center is the tower, and each of these beams corresponds with the bear, the rat, the turtle. I can't remember all of them, but
Yeah.
as in Roland's world, as everything is starting to fall apart, those beams are starting to disintegrate, and once that happens, the tower goes, and once the tower goes, we all go.
Mm. Okay.
and the person who wants to destroy the tower is the Crimson King, which may be inspired by the Yellow King.
Right. And Crimson King is also described as the embodiment of evil, but he's also just a facet of Gan, who is the god of the multiverse. Gan is just this thing that emerges from the void and decides that it's going to create the universe and creates more than one. And we don't really know much about it. We know that it's sort of not evil, but it's not benevolent either.
Right.
But the Crimson King is definitely its evil side. And of course, there's the servant of the Crimson King, who has many names and who is often compared to Nyarlathotep. Richard Ferris, Raymond Fiegler, the Walking Dude, the Dark Man, the Tall Man, or Randall Flagg. And he appears in The Stand, Eyes of the Dragon, the Dark Tower series, Hearts in Atlantis.
Yeah.
Does he
And,
actually show up in Hearts of Atlantis?
Yeah, as I think Raymond Fiegler.
Oh, okay, right.
He's alluded to. I don't think he makes a physical appearance, but
Yeah.
The chief female character mentions him, and it's.
And then I think he's in Gwendy's Button Box too. So, but
Yeah, I didn't quite buy that was him in there, or if it was such a different version of him. He didn't seem to be on an evil path so much as just an otherworldly figure.
Now, I have not read The Cell, but I've seen the movie. And in the movie, he appears.
He wasn't in the book.
He wasn't in the
No.
book? Okay. So they took...
And I didn't realize he appeared in the movie.
Oh, yeah.
Huh. I would say I'll have to watch that again, but no. It's not worth it.
I heard it was bad.
Well, I think that character. What happens a lot with horror writers who mimic Lovecraft to some degree is they'll start out with a creation that parallels very closely a Lovecraft creation, and then that character will take on a life of its own and get away from the model. And if you look at Randall Flagg in The Stand, where he says one of his aliases is Nyarlathotep.
Yeah.
He's very much like Nyarlathotep. He sometimes appears as a dark man, which is similar to the black man in Dreams from the Witch House. He is commanding animals, which is sort of like in Lovecraft's fungi from Yuggoth. Wild beasts shall follow him and lick his hands.
Yeah. Used by Block in his sequel.
Shadow from the Steeple.
Right.
So when I said, this is Nyarlathotep under another name. But when I started to get into the Eyes of the Dragon and more of the Dark Tower, eventually, how his storyline ends, it was sort of like, this can't be Nyarlathotep.
Yeah, and it doesn't jive with how I've interpreted Nyarlathotep either, but that it's the way it is. It's the way one writer has interpreted and expanded on the creation that now spans close to 50 years?
Right. But I think he started out being a version of Nyarlathotep, and then I think King just wanted to kind of divorce him.
Yep.
More from Lovecraft.
Yeah. So, King has sampled directly from Lovecraft in both Grandma and the Mangler. Hastur is the primary evil god and motivating factor there. And then in Jerusalem's Lot, the Vermis Mysterii appear, and the god is the worm. We don't really get a.
He's given a name too.
Is he? I have to go back and read it.
Yeah, or at least they utter a spell, and it looked like that this was the name of the worm-like entity.
Yeah.
Something that begins with a G.
Okay. Revival. What's the big bad? Mother.
Yeah, I thought that was like his version of Shub-Niggurath.
Yeah. But my favorite Lovecraftian god is from Children of the Corn. He who walks behind the rose.
Right.
I've always thought that that's just some sort of worm-like entity living in the ground. And maybe I'm too influenced by the movie. But
was it worm-like in the story?
I think we never see it at all until it goes up in flames.
I was thinking more of a. I was thinking it closer to Great God Pan, Shub-Niggurath.
Well, King does bring in Pan in one of his stories, the Lawnmower Man.
Yeah.
Not the crappy movie, but if you guys remember in the Lawnmower Man, the guy who taught the Lawnmower Man how to go behind the lawnmower and eat grass is Pan.
Yeah.
And
Well, I thought he was working for Pan. Doesn't he say something like, "We're all in service to Pan"?
Yeah. So there's that. And now I want to stray into some weird sort of demigod-like things or forces that might not be considered gods, but the Langoliers. These are, in my mind, they're a lot like the Hounds of Tindalos.
They eat time.
Yeah, they eat dead time. Go ahead, Kelly. Oh.
No, I'm thinking about it. I think I agree.
Yeah, they're not quite gods, but they might be a force of the universe that we should consider.
I would prefer it as such instead of gods, because they didn't seem like they had any kind of intelligence behind them.
Right.
They were just a cleanup.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about these guardians of the beams, and that got me thinking about a Buick 8 and the theory that the car is just this thing that regulates evil and between multiple universes.
Now, in Hearts in Atlantis, the low men in yellow coats were driving cars like that, right? That was what that was one of those kind of cars, wasn't it?
I think so.
Yes.
I guess my thought on this is just as an isolated story. From a Buick 8, it wasn't that the car, I didn't view it as evil. It was just to a place that was so different. That like when the alien appeared, they attacked it for being such a wrong thing.
Right.
Then if humans appeared in that world, they did, the people who lived there did the same thing. and it didn't strike me that that was like a specific evil, but just so entirely alien. So
Right, and that's why I'm not comparing the Buick Gate to a god, but more like a gatekeeper, something. And once again, now I got to invoke it. Yog Sothoth. I am the gate. I am the key. It's sort of, it's something in that's not part of any world, but maybe exists on the edge of multiple ones. Does that make sense?
Yeah, which probably makes it more Lovecraftian than most of Stephen King's gods, because his gods, like Rick was saying, I think he gets something going and then it gets away from him. And so when you've got the kids up against Pennywise and it turns out to be an ancient alien evil, eventually you need to now invoke some kind of opposite and
Right.
equal good so that they can win at the end, which is what they have to do. And that ends up taking it away from Lovecraftian writings
Right.
and brings it more in line with Derleth's view, is that almost all of the old ones had an
Opposite.
opposite elder god
So
that could
Cthulhu
battle
gets
them.
disbanded.
Right? Yeah, that's not.
The crystal octopus.
I find it interesting that the turtle never really shows up in the movies of it.
There's a lot of little drops in that movie if you were looking for it. If you knew about the turtle, you could see a lot of turtle motifs in that It film. So I have a feeling he's going to show up in the sequel.
Yeah, and in the miniseries, there's a brief instant where it's almost like a cheap Gamera comes flying down the tunnel, like spinning sideways with 4 flaming ports. Am I wrong, Kelly? Am I misremembering?
You know what? I hate that fucking miniseries. So I am one of the few people who, I guess I was too old when that came out. I was already in my 20s when the TV series came out, and I know a lot of younger people look back on that as a very scary television show, but I just thought it was a very bad television adaptation.
Well, it was some of Tim Curry's best work.
Tim Curry was great in it, and most of those kids were great too. It's just that they just did not have the money to do anything, and it's very apparent at that end when we get the spider and Gamera.
See, now that I've said it, you can't unsee it, right?
Yeah, no, I shall forever refer to him.
And it's funny because we talk about Randall Flagg as being Nyarlathotep, but there are a couple other characters that I think might better suit that kind of trickster role, and that's Leland Gaunt.
Yes.
And Andre Lenoge.
That's from Storm of the Century, the second one.
Yeah. I really
Yeah.
like the Andre Lenoge character. And this idea that, and he kind of brings it back later in on their book called, with the True Knot group, this collection of psychic vampires that are semi-immortal, that feed off of emotions and pain.
Which one was that in?
Is that Dr. Sleep?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's sort of like there's a semi-secret society that Andre Lenoge belongs to.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
And say he was not immortal.
No,
he was long-lived. That was the whole plot.
Right.
He needed an heir.
Yes, and some of the True Knot, they say they're almost immortal, and I'm kind of trying to figure out what the difference is.
Well, in Needful Things with Leland Gaunt, there's a piece of graffiti says Yog Sothoth
rules.
Yeah. That's what it was.
And I think one of the things he's talking about selling is a horn from Dunwich, something like that.
I think that, and then also his car, which is a modified Tucker, I think comes from Yuggoth or something like that. Also,
Wasn't the horn from Yuggoth in the one was the dog?
Cujo?
No, it's a novelette in a collection of like 4 or 5 stories. Something like Sundog.
Sundog.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think you're right. Anyway,
The guy who sells the camera sells.
The Sundog.
right.
You're right. There was a camera that was bought from some guy, and he also had a horn from Dunwich.
Interestingly, that's the collection. It's 4 Past Midnight. That's the one that has the Langoliers in it.
Okay. And the other thing I want to talk about is the Tommyknockers, where all the aliens are actually dead, and it's the ship itself is exerting a force over the population, trying to turn them into aliens.
Which is a very Lovecraftian idea.
Yeah. And it had been years since I read this story, and I went back and looked at it this weekend, and I had forgotten that they were from Altair 4, which is a reference to Forbidden Planet with the Krell.
Yeah.
Which is the exact thing I was trying to do when I give the ancient ones in Antarctica the name the Krell, is reference Forbidden Planet. It's kind of an interesting idea in that the Tommyknockers having a power to give people what they want, and that's the same thing that got the Forbidden Planet people wiped out. This sort of ultimate subconscious power to do whatever you want, but that since you can't control your subconscious, it'll destroy you.
So has anybody, I'm sure somebody has because somebody's always done something, put together a hierarchy of King's Lovecraftian gods? And I did read that Nerdist article too, and I thought it was pretty light on.
Right. I think we've done 10 times the work right here.
Right. So we know that Gan sits at the very top, but that's almost a as I recall, that's almost a almost our god.
Right. Right.
It created the entire universe, and then the Pennywise creature and the turtle are directly beneath Gan.
Maybe the Crimson King is above because he's a facet of Gan.
Yeah, that makes sense because we know that Pennywise is basically female, because that was the crux of the second part of the story, was they needed to kill before more Pennywises could be created.
Right. Now, whether it's true or not, the turtle supposedly at one point relates a story where it got sick and coughed up our universe. But,
Which I think was King trying to tie into some Eastern mysticism and mythology with the turtle, basically the whole of the world sitting on the turtle's back and all of that stuff. Yeah, I love King as much and maybe more than a lot of the people here, but let's remember he was either shit-faced during his early years or coked out of his mind during his middle years, and then on painkillers after he got hit by the truck. So he wrote a lot of these things when he was out of his mind. I'm not sure that he ever thought that there was a connection in between stories, unless it was towards the end of the Dark Tower when it felt like he was kind of shoehorning things to make them fit.
Well, I kind of like the idea that whether it was you or Rick was talking about that, this career has spanned more than 50 years. And maybe, you don't want to be stuck with the crappy ideas you came up with when you were younger, and you want to move on and take some of what you did, but not leave other stuff behind. Which is kind of why I think, I do think that Dreamcatcher is a rewrite of it in a lot of ways. It's a more mature version of it.
Do you like the book Dreamcatcher?
I do.
Do you like it better than it?
No.
Okay.
I didn't say, yeah.
So
I
it's
like
also,
it because it is firmly rooted in my childhood.
Right.
it is also one of the most overtly political books.
Now, Steve, for me, it is rooted in the fact when I had overread King, I was burning out, and it was like when you put a cap in the, that's my interest in Stephen King. Boom, it's gone. It took years for me to get any more. So it's completely opposite of the.
I remember that being, I was already a full-fledged King fan. I think it came out when I was 16 maybe, and that was my first brand new hardback purchase because I couldn't wait for the paperback. And I remember it was, 800 pages and cost $17 or something like that. And that was a big deal to me. And I really, really love it. And it's interesting, the problematic scene towards the end that comes up for everybody didn't seem weird to me at all at 16 while I was reading it. When you're only a couple of years older than those kids, I think that all that stuff kind of it goes through your mind and makes sense. It's only as an adult that you read it and you get comfortable, at least that, or you get uncomfortable with the scene of Beverly and the boys. At least that's how I feel. I don't know, Rick, how you feel about it.
I have to reread it.
So I remember reading that, and I had just finished Jack Chalker's Well of Souls series about the same time. And there is a if you haven't read the Well of Souls, the basic premise is that you are scattered throughout the universe are little gates that if you fall through, they're one way, you can't get back. You end up on Well World, which is the experimental world where all the makers decided to test out all the creatures that they would populate the universe with. And then you are forced to go through another gate, and you end up in one of these tiny little hexagon countries and transformed into something completely different. And
was that the one about Nathan Brazil or something?
Yes, Nathan Brazil.
I read all of those.
Yeah. Well, one of the characters ends up having to be a hermaphroditic sex slave. And there are some pretty graphic descriptions of what's going on in there. So, what happens next in it seems pretty reasonable in comparison. So I think it also is based on what you've read before and how you feel about strange relationships.
That makes sense.
Anyway, have I missed anybody major?
Well, yeah, I've got a couple.
Okay.
Pet Cemetery. This is more Derlethian than Lovecraft. Pet Cemetery has a Wendigo-like entity.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's the source of what's ever going on in that graveyard.
Yes.
And to get back to Children of the Corn, the girl who loved Tom Gordon.
Yeah.
There's something in the forest that I thought might be the same as the god from Children of the Corn. It looks vaguely like a bear at one point, but there seems to be some forest entity in that.
Interesting. I never connected those two. You might be onto something there.
Yeah.
Do we want to go into the rat angle?
Yeah. Lots of rats in King.
A lot of influence of Rats in the Wall. Jerusalem Lot being the most obvious. Besides the worms, it has rats.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a question when we were off camera about whether Salem's Lot and Jerusalem's Lot are in the same place because
Yeah, from Rich. Yeah.
yeah, Salem's Lot in the vampire novel says his original name was Jerusalem's Lot. When I first read them, I thought they were totally different places, and I think if you read them, you'll get that impression. But there have been articles by the one I read in the Stephen King universe by Christopher Golden, where he links the two. He writes a history of Salem's Lot and makes it the same place.
Okay.
But I don't really see a very strong connection there, other than coincidence of names. So I'm not sure if Stephen King intended them to be the same place.
Well, could it even be in, King has very similar multiversal worlds.
Right.
It could be, yeah.
It could be he wrote those. He created them before he got into the multiverse in Dark Tower. So could be. He's also got rats in Graveyard Shift, where guys were they building a mill or something, and all these giant rats appeared out of the earth.
Yeah, they were cleaning out an old cotton mill. And
there's a story called Nona, which the plot is there's this college dropout who gets seduced by a beautiful woman who has him, transforms him into a serial killer at all intents and purposes. And at the end, she takes him to a graveyard, turns into a rat and disappears. He gets arrested, ends up in an asylum, and is going to commit suicide because he hears rats in the walls.
What collection is that in?
Skeleton Crew.
Ah, okay.
And I won't go into it. I don't remember it as well, and I don't want to go into it because it's now a movie on Netflix, 1922. Has somebody being haunted by rats.
yeah, I watched that this afternoon. It was good. Very good. Kept my attention. Kept me from doing actual work.
Yeah, yeah, I loved it.
Now, the rats in Rats in the Wall work for Nyarlathotep, so which beggars the question, do the rats in Stephen King's work for Randolph Flagg? If you want to be interconnectable.
All right. Anybody
Guys,
else?
Yeah, I got a question. What about Cthulhu and N?
Yeah, well, I think we mentioned Cthulhu.
Did we? Did I miss it?
Yeah.
Okay.
As sort of like another. Didn't we tie it into like the thing from a Buick 8?
No, we didn't, but that
No.
that makes complete sense.
Okay.
King says that's more Mackin than,
Right.
and I think he's thinking of the great god Pan, where the concept of stone circles were introduced, was the Nodens, Lord of the Great Abyss reference.
Sure, but it sure seems Lovecraftian as well.
Well, because Lovecraft took the stones and put them in the Dunwich car.
Is all this stuff, do you think he really meant to fit all this together, though, really? Or,
No, I think that this has been a growing mythology that has gotten out of hand, and there might be attempts to tie this stuff together, but I have a feeling that there are events like, Mr. King, I saw this in this story, and I saw that in this story, and I noticed that this and this could go together. Is that what you meant? And he's like, yeah, that's a good idea.
Well, and he's given himself an out with all of the
multiverse,
and how everything is just slightly different. The
Yep.
gods even appear to be just slightly different from each other in these universes. So, I think that's exactly what happened. As a young writer, he was more influenced by Lovecraft. and now as a mature writer, he's probably playing around with his own ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, he wants Randall Flagg to be thought of as Randall Flagg, not an avatar of Nyarlathotep.
Right.
It's just like was, let's say, F. Paul Wilson. The Keep is very tied in the Cthulhu mythos if you read it in isolation. But as the adversary cycle evolves, it's got parallels to the mythos, but it's pretty much its own thing.
Yeah, I've been playing around with this idea of building a timeline of authors who have borrowed from from Lovecraft, and then spun off their own universes, like King, like Lumley, and like F. Paul Wilson.
Ramsey Campbell.
Ramsey Campbell, yeah. And those are just a few examples. But it would be interesting to build sort of like one of those beautiful little flowery charts with the branches coming off, and like show what story this author is drawing from, and then how that becomes their own universe. Like the Necroscope series is based on.
Okay, but let's not get carried away. I mean, remember when Lovecraft wrote his like, what is the?
That's the whole point, to get carried away.
He wrote this like genealogy of elder gods and stuff.
Yeah, but it was a joke, and people took it seriously.
Doesn't make any sense, and it conceptually doesn't really fit, and it makes them too, frankly, human or comprehensible. So
Comprehensible, yeah.
can you just live in the moment here?
You can, but there are those of us who are splitters, and there are those of us who are lumpers. And I'm a very big taxonomy guy.
All right.
Well,
I tried. Okay, world, I tried.
Also, just we should point out that King also, maybe like Lovecraft, was, Lovecraft's mythology wasn't totally consistent within itself. It changed to the needs of every story. So Great Old One means something different in whatever story you read.
Yep. Now,
so, there's a little of that in Stephen King. You're evolving your mythology.
Right. Rich, what do you want to ask?
Speak.
Well,
No, your window's gone. Never mind.
That was it.
I was just thinking, and I've only read a couple of King's books, The Stand, and then I think Skeleton Crew, and one other collection. But I've not read the Dark Tower series, but I see a lot of Lovecraftian references in King, and it is really interesting how he draws and how he gives props to H.P. Lovecraft as an important figure in American fiction. But I've also heard it said, or actually King has said explicitly, that he was heavily influenced by Tolkien when writing the Dark Tower series. And the Tolkienian worldview and the Lovecraftian worldview are exact opposites. So in Tolkien's world, there is good and there is evil, and good is going to win out. And I'm having a hard time right now pulling out Tolkienian references. And I guess, to what extent do you think that a lot of this is more Tolkienian than Lovecraftian, or vice versa? I find it much easier for me to spot the Lovecraftian references than, say, the Tolkien's influence.
I'll take this. I think that if you haven't read any of the Dark Tower and you're hearing that he was influenced by Tolkien, then it might seem strange because you don't really see that in his other stuff. Although I'd argue that The Stand has a lot of Tolkien in it. But the Dark Tower series is straight up fantasy sci-fi with hints of horror in it. And it's an epic quest with a massive backstory and a cast of thousands, and there's just a lot of stuff going on that does feel very much like something you'd find out of Lord of the Rings. And the big bad in the Dark Tower series, the Crimson King, and then Randall Flagg underneath him, those feel far more like a Sauron character than a Cthulhu type character to me. And his characters are being given the abilities and the knowledge to fight that stuff as a force for good. So that series in particular has a good versus evil feeling to it. And I think that's a holdover from when he first started writing it, because if you look in The Stand, there's a lot of very blatant Judeo-Christian mythology and symbology in that film, and that was something that he was pulling on. Same thing with Salem's Lot. He had, at least in his early writings, a very clear idea of good and evil, and I don't think he really started playing with the Lovecraftian stuff in novels until he had pushed out of that.
Before, you're saying it was more his short stories that he touched on.
Right.
Yeah.
What do you think? Okay, if you're going to say Tolkien was an influence, what about Robert Browning? Come on. I mean, isn't that where the poem came from? Where he got the idea of Roland coming to the Dark Tower? I see more. I mean, even if you just want to say he's making hand-waving gestures in that direction, I didn't really find much of Tolkien in the Dark Tower.
Well, okay, certainly in The Gunslinger, I think you're finding that. But as the story progresses, did you read the entire Dark Tower series, Matt?
Working on it.
Okay. As the series progresses, it becomes much more than that first book, which is basically a spaghetti western set in a post-apocalyptic desert. And then it turns into, basically each book, you can kind of tell where and when he wrote this and what mood he was in and what the date was, because the drawing of the three he didn't get to until whatever 6 or 7 years later. It's the early 80s, and it feels very much like an early 80s action film. And then as you get into what was after that, The Wasteland, that's where I think that he starts kind of getting his own voice and figuring out where he wanted this story to go. And it does start feeling like a Lord of the Rings kind of story by book 3.
I wonder if they'll ever adapt The Eyes of the Dragon into a movie.
Boy, it seems like a no-brainer to me.
Yeah.
I think that we're seeing now, like I had said back when we were talking about the Dark Tower, that it seems to me it's almost a waste to adapt these books like it or these series into feature-length films because of what you have to cut out and change, and that it makes more sense to start a Netflix series or a Hulu series. And I'll say 11/22/63, probably my favorite King book and my favorite King adaptation on Hulu. I thought they did that wonderfully because they had the time to do it.
Yeah,
So
we're kind of in a second golden age of television because of things like Netflix and Hulu.
Right. So it seems to me like, especially with the deals that Netflix is making, that Eyes of the Dragon would be wonderful as maybe an animated story.
You lost me at animated.
Well, it is sort of more a kids type.
Yeah.
I mean, it was sort of a children's book to an extent.
It does feel like a fairy tale, yeah.
I mean, Kelly,
Yeah, it is.
I like your idea. I mean, the Stephen King hour or Stephen King presents.
Well, you got Castle Rock coming.
Right. Castle Rock.
Right. But is that going to work off of original pieces, or is it going to?
They're being pretty cagey with what they're letting us know.
Yeah.
I feel like, I mean, I would love it if we were to see characters and secondary characters from his books. So if it all has to take place in Castle Rock, then we'd get characters from Cujo and the Dead Zone, stuff like that. I mean,
Right.
if Sheriff Bannerman is not a part of Castle Rock, then I'll be very disappointed. But it'd be neat to see that whatever original story they plan on telling, that one of the secondary or tertiary stories happens to be about the little boy and his mom that are cornered by the Saint Bernard. So I'd hope that there's something like that going on, but I don't know.
Is Bannerman the first sheriff or the second one?
He's the first one.
He's the first one.
Yeah, Pangborn comes in after him, and I think he's the sheriff up through Needful Things.
Yeah. We should also point out that when when King directly uses a Lovecraftian prop, he sometimes alters it for his own purposes.
Oh, sure.
Like in Revival, and he used Mysteries of the Worm, De Vermis Mysterious from Robert Bloch twice. Jerusalem's Lot doesn't do any contradictory usage of the book, but Revival gives it a whole different history. I think the author is still Ludwig Prynne, but he has a different biography,
Right.
different century, totally different.
While we're on King, Kelly, you mentioned that 11/22/63 is your favorite book. Is that right?
If I had to really think about it, I think that it is certainly the best book he's written in the last 20 years, and maybe my favorite because the ending, he nailed the ending for once, and I just thought that everything. Yeah, I thought that he really tied everything up beautifully in that story.
You don't think he nails the ending in a lot of books?
Not in most books, certainly not in his later days. I think The Dead Zone is a wonderful book from start to finish and a beautiful ending. But when you get into stuff like Tommyknockers or even that gets a little wacky at the ending, and I kind of scratch my head and wonder what was going on. Certainly when you get into Under the Dome, I loved that story, and then the last 50 pages I just was groaning, very difficult to get through, and I think that that's kind of his thing. I know you guys all love From a Buick 8, and I think I didn't like that, but I feel like I need to reread it again, and I'm wondering if I didn't like it because I did not like the ending.
Well, you're obviously wrong, and we're right.
Sure, I knew that.
Well, I'm going to defend Kelly here. I didn't like it as much, and I felt that it didn't go anywhere.
Right. There was no payoff.
True. Yeah, I mean, it had great scenes in it, but I didn't get a climax, or it didn't move to an ending. It's just like,
it seemed to me in a lot of ways kind of like life, where you don't always get a satisfactory ending. And he's basically saying, this is what happened. We don't really understand it, and we never really got an answer.
I get enough of life from life. I want my books to tie up nicely. It was part of the problem with The Colorado Kid was, he gave that excuse as, well, this is just how it happened. And I'm like, well, that's not why I read a book. Certainly not why I read a mystery.
A mystery without a solution.
Right.
Yeah.
You can write that. I mean, there have been horror stories where there's a lot that's vague, and then you get into debates what was going on and so forth. But I just felt that something more suspenseful should have happened at the end of From a Buick 8.
I won't disagree with that. Yeah.
Oh, geez, Rick, Golden Boy, he won't disagree with that. But if I say something about it, oh, you're obviously wrong.
Right.
Yeah. So 11/22/63. If that's your favorite or one of your favorites, what about the rest of you guys? I would probably throw. I don't know if I can pick a favorite, but I would certainly throw Doom McKee out there as one of my favorites. What about you guys?
Joyland. Really love that book.
I still have not read that one.
It's not supernatural. It doesn't tie in with any of these others except in The Bear's Hint of a Way. I mean, there are reasons I like Revival. There's reasons I like From a Buick 8 because of the very Lovecraftian feel. And I find a lot of his books extremely readable. In fact, when I'm driving in a car and I want to listen to a book on tape, an unabridged Stephen King is like the best thing going.
Yeah.
And
sure.
I've enjoyed a lot of his short stories, but if I have to pick one book that was my favorite, maybe it's because it's my favorite book of his that I read recently. I mean, I've got a long association with the guy. He doesn't even know me. He doesn't know him. It's really a wonderful read.
Yeah. Pete, what about you?
I'm still stuck on it. It for me was King. When King deals with the unresolved issues of childhood that adults have to face, that I feel is like when King is doing his best work. Whether that's in it or
Library policeman.
yeah, or whatever. I mean, that is, that theme, that subtext really.
That theme is in Library Policeman?
No, that theme is in there. We were kids and we did something, and for better or worse, it's going to come back to haunt us as adults.
Yeah.
And him dealing with that issue is him for me. It's him at his best.
You guys have told me several times now to read Library Policeman, and for some reason, I keep forgetting. I'm going to have to read that.
Yeah,
You guys seem to really like it, right?
yeah, I liked it. It's it's more of a novelette than a novel.
And there is some suggestion that the Library Policeman is related to it. So
They have a similar weakness.
yeah, I have a phone call coming in. I'll be right back.
All right.
Get out of here.
Yeah.
God, I'm so glad he's gone.
The concept in it and the Library Policeman, which I kind of liked, is if you're going to have some counterforce to the evil, it's always been a religious object, a crucifix or an elder sign in Jolithian Lovecraftian fiction. And King's concept was it's really human belief and you need something to focus.
Yeah, your faith has to be strong enough. And if it is, then no matter what you have your faith in, that will work as some kind of talisman.
Yeah, it could be a crackerjack toy.
Like in Salem's Lot, when the guy with the cross,
Right.
the pastor, I think it was.
Well, and then his faith was not strong enough, and so the cross, as a priest, didn't even work for him. But then
Exactly.
and the doctor put together 2 tongue depressors and bless it really quickly, and that works for them because they do believe. And then that happens in it also with the kids and in the Library Policeman. I think it's a really, really neat idea.
I just want to point out for favorite novels, I like needful things a lot.
Yeah, I was about to ask you.
That's a good one.
Rich, Paul, do you guys have a favorite? I think one of you told me you haven't read a lot of King yet, but let's go with Paul. What about you?
I've actually only read parts of King's works. I think I read part of Cujo in high school, and that's it. So,
Okay. All right. What about you, Rich?
I'm in agreement with Pete. It really blew me away, and when you read it reads like a guy who really enjoyed his childhood and was really in key with all the trials and tribulations and joys of growing up in the 1950s. I felt like I was in the 1950s. The music, just the kinds of friendships that seem quaint today, those types of relationships with neighborhood kids in this day and age. But I also agree with Matthew in that King's writing really makes his books enjoyable to listen to. And I just finished re-listening to it recently. I also just finished listening to Dr. Sleep. So I find myself in the car a lot. So I mostly listen to audiobooks by King because they're really easy to listen to.
Yeah. Well, you've probably heard me on this show. And it's got 3 different voice actors. If you like listening to King, that's in Just After Sunset. The novelette in, I think it's a novelette or novella. So,
don't get me wrong. When I'm bashing his endings or anything like that. I mean, I'm still right there buying my first edition hardback Kings, and that's just about all I buy anymore. That's a first edition hardback, unless I know the author, because everything else I read on the Kindle. So King, his writing, I think, is still just amazing. And even when I don't like a story, I can always find a lot of really stuff to like in his writing.
Yeah, Kelly, you were talking about how he he has a problem ending some stories. I find the same problem with Dan Simmons. That Dan Simmons can't end the novel to save his life.
Boy, I don't know. I felt that way with Drood.
I feel that way with Summer of Night.
I felt that way
I
with
love
Summer of
Summer
Night
of Night.
and the Carrying Comfort. I think they're great stories, but Carrying Comfort ends, and it's still got like 60 pages because he has to tie up everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have to
Boy,
find out.
I loved Summer of Night, though. I thought that was
so do I.
I think they're good books, but
It's a great book.
they carry on just. I don't need to know all these details. It's like that scene at the end of Animal House where they tell you exactly what happened to everybody.
Yeah.
It's not necessary.
There are very few books which have a, shall I say, blow away ending. They'll have like a decent ending.
Yeah.
But one where it's nailed and it's like memorable and you'll never forget it.
What is it about?
For me, that's
go
the
ahead.
Dead Zone. The Dead Zone, I think, nails that ending beautifully. And, spoilers on a 40-year-old book, but, he stops Stilson from basically starting World War III. The Dead Zone is one that you guys all might want to read again, which seems very timely considering our current political situation.
That's why I don't want to read it. You liked, I'll get back to King in just a second, but you liked, Kelly, Summer of Night. Did you like A Winter Haunting, the sequel?
Not as much, to be honest.
Yeah.
I love Summer of Night. That's one of the ones that it used to be, and maybe it was that horror or really good horror was not as available to us. And so I would do a lot of rereads, and especially with Stephen King. That stopped probably around Tommyknockers for me. I started reading other authors, and if you're reading The Stand for the 6th time, you're thinking to yourself, I could probably be reading something new. But Summer of Night fit into that category. I would read that every other year. In fact, I've got a signed first edition of that, and he wrote, thanks for the revisit every other year, because I told him that I read it so many times. Summer of Night, I love.
I've read that probably 4 times myself.
Yeah, Winter Haunting, I didn't love. But then when you get into like Badlands or The Terror, I'm right back with Dan Simmons. I think that maybe part of the problem, Pete, is that he does so much research that he feels like I need to get my money's worth out all the time I spent researching this, and so that's why he feels like he needs to tie every single thing up. Speaking of which, did everybody else see the trailer for the AMC series of The Terror that's coming out next year?
I have not.
Oh, is it? I hadn't even heard about it.
Yeah, it looks so good.
Sounds great. Wow, nice.
Yeah.
There's been an issue to me with a lot of novels as I look back at them. It's how you handle exposition.
Yeah.
I feel if you have like in like the classic mysteries, they have all the exposition at the end, and a lot of that seems to weaken the story. It seems anticlimactic, and I think it's sometimes better to the best thrillers, you get the exposition as suddenly you're going like so and so's the killer, and you then have to stop him from murdering his last victim.
Yeah, Gerald's game, the exposition at the end, it could have been done a different way. It didn't have to be exposition.
Right.
For example.
I mean, even though I enjoyed the book and I enjoyed when they were making the film, I said it's going to be it's going to drag a little bit at the end because they have to explain something.
So let me ask you guys this: we're talking about Dan Simmons, we're talking about Stephen King. And I hope my question makes sense. But what do you like to get all of you guys' take on this? But Stephen King, he seems to be and he obviously is just sort of in a league of his own. I mean, he's immensely rich. He's because of all of his writing. He's, even people who don't read horror know who Stephen King is. Whereas you can't say the same thing about, say, Bentley Little or Dan Simmons, even though these guys are very, very successful. The league that surpasses them all. Why is that? I mean, I wouldn't say it's because he's more talented. Is he just more accessible to that average reader? What is it? What do you guys think?
I think King tapped into something. He was, definitely right place, right time, because there wasn't that going on in the 70s. And if you read some of those things, Carrie it kind of sits by itself with the way it's written. But once you get into Salem's Lot and then The Shining, those feel very much like the kind of books that were being written in the 70s if they had supernatural overtones. They're very dramatic, melodramatic even. But I think King's strength is that he taps into something in all of us. There's no question why most of his characters are writers. It's because he's a writer and he's pulling his memories of what it was like to have writer's block or alcoholism, whatever it was. And so when you do something like that, even if you don't identify with it immediately, you understand it as a truth because you can see it in the real world. It's the same thing with Johnny Smith in The Dead Zone. He was a teacher. He got away from writing about writers and turned him into a teacher, which was what King was before he was a writer. So all of these things, I think, have a really strong ground in realism. And so then when the wild stuff starts happening and the characters react in a way that you go along with the wild stuff without question. And I don't think that was happening much when he was writing that. There were certainly great novels being written, but not in out and out horror fashion.
I would echo that. I would say part of the thing that King does so very well is the characters are the people you know. Their interior life is like your interior life or the interior life of your neighbor or family. And so it's very easy to identify with the people that he writes about. And so when these things happen, you sort of almost feel like it could be happening to you or someone you know. I don't think there are many authors who can get that. I don't know.
Rick, what were you going to say?
Matt beat me to the punch. I was going to say it was his characterization. And I think it's because we care who these people are. While, like, let's say in most of Lovecraft's fiction, the guy is an archaeologist or something from Miskatonic University. You really don't care about him. I don't really care about Professor Engel from Call of Cthulhu.
Right.
Well, and certainly if you're finding Lovecraft probably the way most of us did, which is a 13 or 14-year-old kid, then all of those characters he's writing about, it's very difficult to identify with. But at the same time, at 11 and 12 reading King, Salem's Lot has, a 12-year-old protagonist in it. The Shining has a 6-year-old kid in it. So when you're 12, 6 years old is not that far away. You can still remember how terrifying it is to be on your own, wandering around in a hallway.
Carrie and Christine, touched the adolescent terror problem.
Right.
But a Lovecraftian forerunner of that, not from Lovecraft, Robert Bloch's Notebook Found in a Deserted House.
Yes, my absolute favorite Bloch story.
When I read that, even though the ending is a little, guy writing when he gets killed, it was a kid. And I remember that impressed me.
I know that's a problem for you, Rick, but I actually think that if you did that today as a found footage film, it would be awesome.
Yeah, well, it's not a problem if somebody if it's either on a telephone or a recording.
Right.
Because then when you're not gonna, when you're writing,
Yeah,
the
it's like
door is opening, the hand,
Yeah, exactly.
he might have. It would have ended better if he said, he realizes something at the end, and then the door starts to burst open. It would have been better if he said, "This is," we later found that.
Right, a postscript of sorts.
Postscript
Sure.
that the door was. We found this in a deserted house where the door had been knocked down, was a battering ram.
Yeah.
Instead, his last Twitter post was very odd.
Yeah.
Well, I've seen that recently. There's people who's like, posting, "There's someone in my house," and like, so you're taking the time to put this on Twitter rather than calling the police.
Right. Instead of hitting 911.
Yeah, they're calling people out for doing this, but people actually either are doing this or are pretending to do this.
Yeah. Bob Price, when he critiqued this, I know Bob Price did write an article critiquing this, and I think he was the person who pointed out that the right way to do this is in the Dunwich Horror, when you have that guy on the phone,
Yeah,
on the party line,
on the party line. Yeah,
or maybe a woman, but
yeah. I think was it the Corey house?
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's when somebody's speaking into something.
Yeah.
Or like, Beast from 20,000 Phantoms, when the guy's on the radio. It's such a fantastic beast. It's opening its mouth now.
Right.
So, anything else we want to talk about in regards to Stephen King? Did we cover everything?
I think we beat this one to death.
I think we did.
Yeah.
So, one of my Patreons, John Williams, asked a few weeks ago in an email to me a very detailed question, and I think it'll probably take us, a few weeks of kind of going over different parts to answer it. But one of the parts of the question, the gist of it was, and I know Pete, you wanted to talk about this, was about getting into Lovecraft and where'd Pete go? Getting into Lovecraft and how that jibes up with being 13 and realizing that the world does not revolve around you and so forth. And you put it really well on the phone with me today, Pete. You want to?
Yeah. Well,
can I get into that a little bit?
I don't know about you guys, but a lot of people in this world are raised up around a certain set ideas, set belief systems. And part of those set beliefs is that you never are supposed to question those beliefs. But as you sort of get into your teens and you start sneaking off to read things that you probably wouldn't be handed out by your parents or something, or you're watching television, you're watching the news, and you see that despite what you're being told, the world is not a great place. Things don't look like they're fair. They're not fair, particularly if you've had a tragedy or some sort of crisis in your life that you have no control over. You know that the world is not a fair place, and no amount of divine intervention seems, or attempts to invoke divine intervention seems to help. So when you're in that sort of a point where you're realizing that the world does not revolve around you, and maybe some of the things you're told about how the world works aren't actually factual, and you come across Lovecraft, and Lovecraft says, the world hates you. The world doesn't care if you're having fun.
Right. It hates you if it cares about you at all.
Right. And if you think that things are going really, really great today, wait till tomorrow, because we'll make it all even out. We will punish you one way or the other. Hey, Matt.
Okay, now I remember back before I found Lovecraft, etc., I was reading a lot of pulp stuff, like back when I thought Kenneth Robeson was a real person, and I'd read like 70 Doc Savage novels and thought he's the greatest author ever, and I read Tarzan, and I read heroic fantasy like Tolkien. And like you say, everything's always seemed to work out for the good, and people did things for the good. And then I remember picking up a collection, and it had a Clark Ashton Smith story in it, like The Seven Gazes. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. And that's when I read, who was it? Jack Vance, did he write Leanne the Wayfarer? About Shun the Unavoidable, basically stealing people's eyeballs. And about the same time, Lovecraft. And it was like, our drink of choice back then was like vodka and tab. It was like a straight shot of it. Those kinds of stories were just, oh my Lord, this is so different than anything I've read before. It just overwhelmed me. I got completely hooked right at that moment.
It was like drinking a Coca-Cola after all that tap.
You go with what you got, buddy.
Yeah, I had a tab a couple years ago. I found it was disgusting. What were we thinking?
Well,
I also wonder if, for me at least, when I found Lovecraft, I was 13, and a lot of his themes are, the outsider, and you don't fit in with what's going on around you. So I think I might have identified more with that than the thought that the world was awful. But I don't disagree with you at all, Pete, that has got to be a part of what part of the attraction is.
Well, yeah, it's sort of but it ties in with that whole outsider mentality. It's like you're like a 13, 14-year-old kid, and you're looking around, and it's like everyone else has drank the Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
And you're like, how can nobody else see this? You're completely outside of that society. And you're just praying that nobody notices, right? Because you're going to get your ass kicked.
Rick?
I was going to say, when I first met Lovecraft, it was in A Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath as a collection published by Ballantine Books. So I met him in an heroic fantasy context. So I'm reading him like Lord of the Rings or John Carter of Mars and so forth. But then the last story in that book was Through the Gates of the Silver Key, which doesn't end well for our recurring hero. And that was a big shock.
Yeah, well, because once again, here's Randolph Carter, right? He has all these wonderful adventures. He's a good guy. And he seems to be a stand-up guy. And yet, in the end, he's sort of trapped in an alien body that he can't get out of. And is that fair?
Right.
It is a sobering discovery when you realize that the good guys don't always win and the bad guys don't always lose.
Right.
Rick, how old were you when you first read Lovecraft?
14.
14, yeah. See, I think that's kind of how we all discover it. I wonder if I had found him as an adult, if I would have been nearly as interested in him.
What you guys seem to be saying is that, monsters and gods aside, it's a realistic viewpoint when you discover Lovecraft. It's jibing with what you realize you've come to realize the universe is a place that is either hostile or doesn't care about you at all. You're not the center of the universe, and neither is mankind.
Well, I think a lot of people are raised up with this idea that the place you're in a good place, and it does revolve all around you,
Mm-hmm.
and everyone cares and is going to take care of you. And then if you're halfway paying attention at all, you kind of realize that may not be entirely true. And then if you find these stories, you see someone else who is taking that as a metaphor for the universe is not a good place. The world is not a good place. And you aren't going to be taken care of. There is no reward. And why should you follow the rules that seem to have been set down? It's a fundamentally different definition of evil than what we're raised through by parents, guardians, and clergy. And that can be quite revelatory at the right time in your life.
Well, I was going to say, I read Lovecraft in 1970, which was during Vietnam, which was an unsettling period. If you had, as a kid, you had this very orderly universe. We fought we fought communism. We didn't question it. And then the whole belief system became questioned.
Right.
So you mentioned this on the phone to me as well, and it's something I said to you that I've thought quite a lot about over the years, is that doesn't it seem like readers of Lovecraft, it draws in a lot of atheists and agnostics?
Yeah, well, I think because it's a different worldview, and it can be very attractive to people who aren't willing to buy that party line and who are willing to question organized religion or religion, period.
Right.
And this is possibly part of the reason why there are actually churches of Cthulhu. There are people following or trying to follow some sort of Lovecraftian path, and invoking elder gods that really don't give a shit about us. Which seems contradictory, but faith has been built on lesser things.
Right.
But yeah, it's sort of like we get sold this bill of goods that if you go to church, or you follow, or the mosque or temple or wherever, and you follow the rules and you do this thing and you do that thing, everything's going to work out fine. And when when people start to question that, they get hand waved and says, well, there's a bigger plan that you just can't see. And then you read some cosmic horror, and that sort of jab there that says, it's not that there's a bigger plan, is that the bigger plan that nobody can see is that the universe is hates us. It hates everything, And if it hates us, we're kind of, at least we matter. But in most cases, it just doesn't care at all.
Right. I was going to say, does it hate us as much as not care at all about us?
Right. I mean, if you might be lucky if it hates you, because it actually means that you matter.
Right.
Which is worse, being hated by something or being completely ignored by it?
Isn't it interesting
Depends on the
that
consequence of being hated. Go ahead, Kelly.
well, isn't it interesting that in today's culture, which is, not to piss off any of our religious listeners or anything like that, but the story of Lucifer being cast out and then coming to Adam and Eve and offering them knowledge, Lucifer would absolutely be the hero in any film that followed this storyline. He's saying, free yourself, here's some knowledge, don't let the man tell you what's right, learn for yourself.
That's the analogy of Prometheus.
Right.
Yeah.
And he'd absolutely be the good guy in a movie that had that kind of storyline.
The problem with your concept is it ends up being a show like Lucifer on Fox.
Well, yeah, which is not to say that, I mean, when I'm watching my religious horror, I want my Lucifer to be evil. But I do think that if you're writing a story like this, that guy, you don't make the little guy the bad guy. The little guy who's fighting against the corporation is always the good guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have something to say on with the knowledge and stuff like that. In the Bible, the knowledge is the dangerous thing because it brings to us death and stuff like that. And it's a lot like that in Lovecraft stories too. Like the simpletons and stuff like that, they just go on not knowing that these horrible things are going on around in the universe, and that really none of this really matters. But the scholars and stuff like that, that knowledge, it's dangerous. It's a very dangerous thing to be smart in these types of situations.
Yeah, and they're no longer in blissful ignorance.
Right,
Yeah.
and that's the whole premise behind things man was not meant to know. This idea that we could expand our knowledge to a point where we could end up destroying ourselves or attracting something that would destroy us. Yeah. But the crazy thing is that the group of people that actually try to do that are the Whateleys. This inbred bunch of hillbillies who just happen to have the book.
Yeah.
It's not Miskatonic University. It's the people who are pretty much banned from the university.
Well, yeah, and an emphasis, like Kelly said, on no disrespect to anyone's beliefs or anything like that. I think it's an interesting thing to talk about, and obviously Lovecraft does appeal to a great many religious people. But I did do a survey a few years ago at the Lovecraft Ezine website, and I asked people to just basically fill out, anonymously if they were atheist, agnostic, or religious, and so on and so forth. And it seemed like, I don't remember what the percentage was, but most of the Lovecraft Ezine followers were on the atheist, agnostic side, which, didn't surprise me because, like we're talking about, that viewpoint kind of appeals to that mindset. So
If the religious people were honestly believe what the Bible tells, I mean, those are the people I would, to be honest, have in power. Is somebody who's got a very strong moral good versus evil. That's the kind of person I want. Unfortunately, we find that most of the time, morality is subjective, and they make it work however they want to feel good about themselves. But for me personally, finding someone who does truly believe that after they're dead they will be judged for good or bad things in their life, and they want to do good, that is always the kind of person I'd rather hang out with.
But if you're only doing good to get a reward or to avoid a negative consequence like hell, are you really doing good for the right reasons?
Well, I don't look down on fear as an incentive. So if you're doing good for the wrong reasons, you're still doing good, right? As long as you're doing good things and it's because you believe that you will be judged, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And keep in mind, I don't believe any of that at all. And it's what we talked about earlier with Lovecraft's and Derleth changing the Lovecraftian gods. You start putting human qualities on them, and I think being judgmental is a human quality, and I find that a god who could create this entire universe and everything in it but still requires you to appease him in some way, that is not a very good god in my mind.
Yeah, I don't disagree with what you're saying. I do find it more laudable, someone who does good and treats people kindly because that is the right thing to do, better than someone who does it because I better treat people right, otherwise I might go to hell.
I agree with you, but I'm also just looking at end result. If it means more good in the world, I don't care how we got there.
Yeah, true. And
So
I'm an idealist, so
as a parent, Kelly, I often have to make the choice between being respected or being feared.
And you always choose fear.
Well, fear is a fabulous motivator.
Was that beer or fear?
Well,
okay.
for 8-year-olds,
cause of
fear.
and
Fear. Fear is a
life's
fabulous motivator in the short run, but in the long run, it doesn't work.
Well, that's like Machiavelli's famous quote about rather being loved than feared as a ruler.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, fear works, but it creates other problems down the line.
Yeah,
I
it
agree with
does. And my son behaves because he loves us and he doesn't want to disappoint us. He doesn't really behave because if he doesn't, I'm going to ground him. You know, and that's the place where you at least want to get to, I think, instead of having a child or an adult act out of fear.
Sure.
But you can see some of this stuff in some of Lovecraft's writings. I mean, we're going to have this conversation again about the ending of The Shadow over Innsmouth. You know, is it a horror story or is it not? It all depends on how you interpret the last couple lines, where I will dwell in wonder and whatever forever. I mean, he's
I think it's a horror story unless you are the protagonist of the story.
Right.
Faith.
But this is to me, this is actually, you know, a question I have, because The Shadow over Innsmouth is actually very similar to the facts in the case of Arthur German. And in the end of Arthur German, the appropriate response apparently is to burn yourself alive.
I'm trying to remember. This is the
White Ape.
the problematic story of the White Ape. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
So-
remember, in Shadow over Innsmouth, the narrator was originally about to commit suicide.
Right, but instead
He changes his mind.
He changes his mind and he accepts, and he becomes something post-human, beyond human.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure, and you know, this is where we can have the argument, and we've talked about this, I think, with Ken Haidt a couple times. It's like, is it a horror story or is it a story about being post-human and accepting?
Depends on your point of view.
The
Exactly.
horror might be that he accepted being post-human.
Exactly, and you know, that is part of the problem, is that it's really open to interpretation, but given that the way that Lovecraft wrote Arthur German, 20, 30 years earlier, whatever it was, you know, those are two different endings that I think are poignant.
Right. It's sort of like the horror story. Clark Edwin Smith wrote a few of these, where the guy realizes, I want to be seduced by a vampire.
Yeah.
It's pleasure beyond imagination. So what if I become a predator for the rest of eternity?
Yeah, it's worth it, right?
Yeah. Or even if you just die from being bitten by a vampire, it's a great way to go out. You have great sex.
So, you know,
Well, that was Clark Edwin Smith's The End of the Story.
yeah.
It goes back. It was originally a French story called Clermont by Gaudier, I think was the writer, where it was the guy gets saved by a vampire, but he gets ticked off that the priest destroyed the vampire with holy water because he was about to have a great night of passion, even though it may have left him dead.
So our conclusions for today is that it's good to be motivated by beer. So that's what we get out of this.
Yeah.
Well, this was a really great discussion today, guys. Thanks.
Yeah, these are kind of some of the issues I touch on in some of the stories in the Peasley papers.
Which is coming out this coming week.
Is it?
It is.
All right.
This has all just been a gigantic advertisement for the Peasley papers, hasn't it?
That's
Way
right.
to go, Pete.
Go Pete, it's your birthday. No, but seriously, you know, this idea that, you know, the universe is not a nice place, and that, you know, what we consider evil and good are very tiny portions of reality. and they're very subjective. And the Peasley Papers is obviously about the Yith, and it spans billions of years, because it deals with the Yith and their concept of playing the long game. And the long game is not a couple weeks or a couple days or a couple years. It's millions of years. And you can do, if that's the game you're playing, then destroying a couple solar systems or a whole species in a span of billions of years, that means little.
Right. So look for the Peasley Papers, print and Kindle, later on this week on Amazon. I don't have an exact date, but it'll be later this coming week. Kelly, you had something else?
Yeah, completely unrelated. So I've been unpacking all my stuff from the Lovecraft Film Festival, which was 3 weeks ago or something. And I came across something that I thought some of our listeners might be interested in, and that you might be interested in, Mike. And that is Signum Crucius Unholy Mutation, which is an extension of the Dreams in the Witch House rock opera. I'm holding these up here.
Nice.
It has, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 extra tracks, and it comes as a comic, or what I thought was a comic. What it then does is, I'm going to back up so I can show everybody what's going on here. It unfolds into this comic that you can follow with the new songs, and you follow the purple or the violet light, basically. So it's really a cool thing, and it's just another thing that Mike Gallagher, the guy who created this, is trying something different. And I haven't listened to the disc yet. Some of the songs are just orchestral versions, so without the dialogue, so you can basically sing karaoke to your Dreams in the Witch House songs.
Which I do.
Oh, certainly. Don't we all? Some of them are with different vocalists, like Courtney Gaines from Children of the Corn. Pete, you'll want to pick this up. He does a voice in here. Who else? I don't know. There's a new Bruce Kulick solo during the I can't remember, Refuge of Penitence, it looks like. Anyhow, I know that we've talked about this in the past, and I think that we're all fans of this, and so this is something I was really happy to pick up. And I'm sure you can go to the website, probably at the HPLHS website, but if not, I would look for the Dreams in the Witch House rock opera, and I'm sure that there's some way to pick it up from there.
Pete.
Yes.
Tomorrow night, you and I are going to do a Patreon podcast, which will be available a couple of days after that for the patrons. What are you going to talk about?
I don't know. Oh, secret. It's going to be a quick version of some of the things I talked about at Necronomicon. Secret things that you probably didn't notice in Lovecraft.
Right. That's right. So we've got a lot of extra content like that for patrons. Just Google Lovecraft Ezine Patreon. And it's very economical, and you'll be supporting the Lovecraft Ezine podcast and press. The
other thing I want to mention is that if you're in Florida, Tuesday night, I will be at Ringling College at 7:00, giving a lecture about my writing.
Nice.
They're doing a monthly author series, and they invited me over. And it's free to the public, and anybody who wants to come over can come over.
Speaking of Pete's writing, and Rick as well, if you go to PeteRolick.com, it'll redirect you to Pete's Amazon page, and you can check out his books and so forth. Same thing with Rick. I've got them both set up this way. RickLay.com, LAI. And it'll redirect to Rick's Amazon page. So, check out their work if you haven't done so already. So, next week, we're going to do a Halloween show with I'm going to do a Halloween show with Jeff and Scott Thomas. And thanks everybody for being part of our little group. Thanks for listening. Thanks guys for the conversation. It was great. And we'll see everybody next week.